Check, check, check. Streaming test. 1, 2, 1, 2. This is sound check for streaming only right now. All right. I already say a few words. Let me know if you were able to hear it. You got me? Okay. Perfect.
Good morning. Hey, let's go ahead and take our seats. Good morning. Welcome back. If you couldn't join us yesterday, I'm Rob Glenn. I'm the Vice President of Global Resilience at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I hope you enjoyed the reception last night. Always good to connect with friends, old and new. One of the best parts of programs like this is the networking, so we're glad you were able to enjoy it. Also, the partnership building and relationship building that comes out of the opportunity to get back together again. So I'm excited to kick off today's programming, and we're going to discuss further the impacts of collaboration in disaster preparedness, recovery, and mitigation, starting with a keynote address by the DHS Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas. And we're going to follow that by panels on pre-disaster investment, what that looks like, building successful partnerships when systems fail, and then lastly, responding to humanitarian crises abroad. Like yesterday, you can follow along on social media or join the conversation using the hashtag Building Disaster Resilience. If you have any questions on how to download the app, just go out to the main area and you can ask a chamber staffer to help you. We'll be accepting questions on the app. And then before we get started in full, I just want to thank our federal partners who really came through this year for this year's conference: the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, CISA, the Small Business Administration, NOAA, and then also U.S. Northcom and NORAD. We also want to thank our SHAPE leaders who generally support our disaster response and global resilience program at the U.S. Chamber Foundation, which is not just this event, it is all year long. So we want to thank Abbott, Amazon Supply Chain, AmerisourceBergen, BD, the Coca-Cola Company, FedEx, Guidehouse, Leidos, the Medtronic Foundation, Procter & Gamble, Shell, and the UPS Foundation. And I'd also like to congratulate yesterday's winner of round-trip tickets from JetBlue. We'll have another raffle later on today. So now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker of the day, U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. The Secretary is the first Latino and immigrant confirmed to serve as Secretary of Homeland Security, and has led a distinguished 30-year career as a law enforcement official and a nationally recognized lawyer in the private sector. Over the years, he has served as the Deputy Secretary of DHS and the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. During his tenure at DHS, he's led the development and implementation of DACA, negotiated cybersecurity and homeland security agreements with foreign governments, led the department's response to Ebola and Zika, helped build and administer the Blue Campaign to combat human trafficking, and developed an emergency relief program for orphaned youth following the tragic January 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Secretary Mayorkas.
Good morning. I didn't expect music to accompany the introduction. Good morning. Thanks very much, Rob, for the introduction, and I want to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this morning. I should say, as I had the chance to speak with Vince a little bit earlier, I and the department have a long-standing relationship, partnership and friendship with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it is emblematic of our commitment to a public-private partnership. So much of what we do in the Department of Homeland Security centers on the importance of resilience, from disaster response and fighting for the climate crisis, to cybersecurity, from health security to combating terrorism and domestic violent extremism. Across this broad range of challenges we face in an ever-evolving threat landscape, there is a common thread, which is that we do not do any of this work alone. We make the greatest difference for the communities we serve when we work, all of us, together. Whether we want to treat this work as a collective effort is, quite frankly, beside the point. We have to. How can government alone ensure the nation's cybersecurity when the overwhelming majority of our nation's critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector? How can government alone fight a deadly pandemic when we rely on the private sector for the development of vaccines and other medicines and supply chain distribution, and we rely on the public to follow public health protocols like masking, physical distancing, and getting vaccinated. And how can government alone combat terrorism and targeted violence when those most likely to recognize indicators of violent behavior are not government officials, but friends, neighbors, family members, and classmates? All of you, as leaders and experts in your respective fields, in the private sector, in academia, at all levels of government, and in nonprofit organizations, are important partners in this shared responsibility. I certainly don't mean to minimize the role of the federal government and the role we can play in building and maintaining resilience. On the contrary, the women and men of the Department of Homeland Security dedicate themselves to this critical task each and every day. Today, I'm pleased to share with you a few examples of our department's work to build resilience in the service of our shared goal of keeping our communities safe. The health resilience of our communities remains top of mind as we have turned a corner in the fight against COVID-19, enabling us all to be here together in this room today. At the same time, we remain cognizant of the need for continued vigilance against COVID-19 and other health security threats. On the first day of this administration, President Biden challenged our department's FEMA to stand up 100 federally supported community vaccination centers in only 30 days. FEMA did not do so. They stood up 441. Over the past year and a half, that number has grown to more than 3,600 community vaccination centers nationwide. We also created and implemented Operation Vaccinate Our Workforce to vaccinate 75,000 of our frontline personnel. As the most public-facing department in the federal government, ensuring the health and safety of our personnel is not just about protecting them and their loved ones, it's also about protecting the health and safety of the American public. The issue of cybersecurity is another critically important element of our national resilience, and one that I know you discussed yesterday with some of DHS's key leaders in this area. I'd like to highlight a few ways in which we are working to raise the bar for cyber resilience across the country. Through CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, we stood up the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, which enhances our ability to work with major private sector cyber stakeholders and operationalize our collective efforts to reduce risk to critical infrastructure. We are also working with those same partners and others to develop cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals. Last year, we kicked off a series of 60-day sprints, each focused on the most important and urgent priorities for increasing our cyber resilience. These sprints focused on transportation, ransomware, cybersecurity, and growing the cybersecurity workforce. We remain acutely focused on growing the workforce. Nationwide, across this country, we are facing a shortage of 700,000 cybersecurity professionals. We've partnered across the board to close this gap, including with our federal partners, like the Departments of Commerce and Labor, in developing and launching an apprenticeship program, and with the Girl Scouts of the USA to grow the cybersecurity skills and awareness of girls in grades K through 12. We not only have to enhance our cyber workforce, but we also have to change its face. Of course, we can't speak about resilience without addressing the threat of climate change. DHS is focused on improving the resilience of communities, particularly of disadvantaged and underserved communities, to the adverse impacts of climate change. We cannot have climate resilience without equity. We know that underserved communities are disproportionately impacted by disasters. Under this administration's Justice 40 initiative, FEMA is working to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits of investments to harden communities against climate change are delivered to underserved communities. Yesterday, you heard from FEMA's Deputy Administrator, Eric Hooks, about one element of the Justice 40 initiative, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC program, and the twofold increase of available funding to $2.3 billion for fiscal year 2022. This program will help communities increase their resilience to extreme weather events and natural disasters by helping them to prepare beforehand through research-supported proactive investments. Through our Science and Technology Director, we're working to find innovative solutions to help increase our community's resilience to disasters. A few of our projects include low-cost flood sensors, early detection sensors for wildfires, and delivering information on evacuation routes to people in endangered areas through our integrated public alert and warning system. Let me take a step back and share with you a powerful example of why we have to work together and the fact that we can't do this alone. Kentucky, a particular area of Kentucky, suffered tragic results of a tornado of unprecedented gravity and duration. And in the immediate aftermath of that tornado, I visited one of the towns that was devastated, Mayfield, Kentucky. And when I say devastated, I mean the entire town was destroyed, except for the resilience of its residents. Not just homes, not just businesses, but the departments, the headquarters of the emergency responders, the place of worship, the bank, everywhere where people's lives were lived, and everywhere where their personal resources were retained. And I visited the candle factory where people had been working when the tornado struck, and there was a safe room in that candle factory where everyone huddled and everyone was trained to go during an occurrence of an extreme weather event. And that safe room did not withstand the force of this tornado. And it was wiped out along with the rest of the candle factory. And of course, the local community was not equipped to respond to the gravity of the disaster. And so the state officials responded very swiftly. And the state officials were not able to address the full gravity of the consequence, and so we in the federal government responded as well. And our funding is limited by statute and regulation with respect to the extent of its reach, and so the private sector came in to provide rescue as well. And so it required an all of community and all of society response to deliver immediate emergency relief for people who no longer had anything. And then looking forward, we take a look at what is required to ensure that the next community that is hit by an extreme weather event of unprecedented gravity, or duration, or consequence, what can we do as a community all together in protecting the next community from this type of event? And one of the things that we thought about and are working on is making sure that local communities, for example, update their building codes so that safe room is not really tailored to the extreme weather events and the consequences of yesterday, but rather what we are experiencing today and what we foresee tomorrow. And then what does a family do when the bank that holds their key documents is no longer in existence? What happens when the Social Security office is no longer standing and its records are no longer accessible. And so we are working on making sure that American residents understand the importance of digitizing the critical documents that guide their lives, and we are preparing as a community to be ready for what might occur tomorrow based on what we have learned today. We read the papers right now and we see the extreme flooding again in Kentucky. We read of the fires in Colorado. Now those in New Mexico are more contained, but we are at a time where we require not just a community response, but community preparedness in the service of community resilience. Terrorism-related threats to the United States also continue to evolve. Several recent violent attacks against minority communities, schools, houses of worship, and mass transit have demonstrated the dynamic and complex nature of the threat environment currently facing the United States, and these events have gripped international attention. Enhancing our collective ability to prevent all forms of terrorism and targeted violence is a top priority of our department and of this administration. We must make it harder to carry out an attack and reduce the potential for loss of life by preventing acts of violence with our partners across the country. We're focused on empowering these partners, ensuring they have the resources, training, and guidance needed to effectively protect their communities. Our Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership, or CP3, provides financial, educational, and technical assistance to support our partners in building and implementing capabilities that help prevent individuals from radicalizing to violence. We have a number of grant programs available to help communities increase their preparedness and get the resources they need to build their resilience. Last year, I designated domestic violent extremism as a national priority area within our Homeland Security Grant Program and dedicated a minimum of $77 million to preventing, preparing for, and responding to domestic violent extremist threats nationwide. We have more funding to offer in this year's grant programs. This year, we're providing $250 million in funding to support physical security enhancements for nonprofits at risk of terrorist attacks through the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. It's an increase of $70 million from last year, a tangible recognition of the threats facing houses of worship and other nonprofits. This year, we're also awarding $20 million to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, nonprofits, and higher education institutions through the Targeted Violence and Prevention Grant Programs. You know, at the beginning of the establishment of our department, the greatest terrorism-related threat that we encountered was the foreign terrorist who wanted to enter the United States and do us harm. And that evolved over the course of the years. That threat, of course, did not disappear, nor has it disappeared. But in that 2012, 2014 area, what rose to our attention was the homegrown violent extremist, the individual already resident in the United States, radicalized by a foreign terrorist ideology, and thereby seeking to do us harm. And we responded as a department, as a federal government, by going into the communities and trying to address that threat landscape. And we, I think, were ineffective in doing so fully because we had not yet closed the gap of distrust between a department like ours and the communities we serve, and particularly minority communities. Now what we see is not the homegrown violent extremist as the greatest terrorism-related threat, the individual radicalized to violence by a foreign terrorist ideology, but rather we're seeing a radicalization to violence born of an ideology of hate, false narratives, personal grievances, other narratives propagated on social media and online platforms. The prior iterations of the threat, as I mentioned, have not disappeared, but we've seen a different brand of threat, if you will, rise to the surface. And here again, the federal government cannot do it alone. If we take a look at the tragedies of Buffalo, New York, Uvalde, Highland Park, what we see is individuals who were exhibiting signs of descending down a path and seeing signs that that dissension was accompanied by an increasing interest in violence. And it is not the federal government that would see those signs in the first instance, nor would it necessarily be local law enforcement. But who is it? Who is it? It is sometimes the family, sometimes friends, a school teacher, a neighbor. And it speaks to the need to work as a community in addressing a threat of domestic violent extremism, and it speaks of the broader need to work as a community in addressing the many challenges we face. Resilience is really defined as a community phenomenon, and it requires a community effort. DHS, our department, brings a lot to the table. Grant dollars, information sharing, technical assistance and best practices, in addition to our own operational capabilities and our extraordinary people. But we're only effective in building resilience when all of us are sitting around that table together. I want to thank all of you for claiming a seat at the table on behalf of the personnel, the dedicated and talented personnel of the Department of Homeland Security. I very much look forward to our work together. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Secretary, for those words, and it's a nice way to set the stage for the next panel, which is going to focus on pre-disaster investments. So we are going to have some good subject matter experts join us here in a second, so without further ado, I'll just ask the next panel to join us.
Good morning. That was kind of weak. I'm Chuck Chadovitz with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I work on sustainability and environment issues, and resilience is in my portfolio. And the U.S. Chamber is becoming more and more active on those issues, and we'll talk a little bit about the policy landscape today from the practical standpoint of public-private partnerships. So first, want to thank Mark DeCourcy and Rob Glenn and the team at the Chamber Foundation for including the U.S. Chamber in this important discussion. This session is a capstone and follows up on our event of Wednesday, in which the U.S. Chamber, together with our partners at the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative and the Pew Charitable Trust, convened a group of business leaders with local, state, and federal government leaders and NGOs to discuss the future of resilience policy. The Chamber has long made building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure among our top priorities. Our resilience principles, which we developed with our broad coalition of partners, call for a comprehensive and strategic approach that allows us all to plan ahead and prepare for the next crisis. I want to offer a brief summary of Wednesday's event, and then we'll dive into a discussion with our panelists. And then I encourage you, I understand that there's a QR code where you can access the app for the conference on your tables, and you can pose questions to the group. We only have a short 40 minutes, so we want to get to those, but it will be good at any rate to have your questions so that we can be responsive to those issues going forward with this group and others to make sure that both the policy and the practical landscape moves forward. And some of these comments that I'll mention echo what Secretary Mayorkas was mentioning in his remarks. So you'll see some common themes. So the first thing that was really underscored at our event was resilience and adaptation are about people and communities. If we don't help the communities and the people living in them become more resilient, these programs are not doing what they're intended to do. Resilience should be elevated as a national priority on equal footing with mitigation. So a lot of discussion in the policy space on climate mitigation. Resilience is kind of put off to the side often. And so I think that's something that we're working at the Chamber to increase its presence. And we have a lot of partners, both those here on stage and elsewhere, that are really helping and underscoring that. The third thing, and you all know this, that with the recent Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, money is no longer a major problem to addressing issues around infrastructure and resilient infrastructure in particular. But more tools and partnerships, public-private partnerships, are needed to succeed. Fourth thing is current statutes do not have all the solutions and may contain barriers to action. Next, the most vulnerable, and this is, I think, where the Secretary talked a little bit, and we'll dive in here as well. The most vulnerable communities that need to build resilience and adapt to climate risk the most often do not have the wherewithal to access the funding. Technical assistance is needed, but government programs may not be the only answer, so public-private partnerships key in that regard. Focus cannot be only on floods, and we tend to focus a lot on that issue, but other hazards such as droughts and wildfires are important to consider. And lastly, and I think something that we'll talk with our first speaker here, more data is needed to target the most at-risk communities. So I'm so pleased to be here with this impressive panel of experts and leaders from our partners. So welcome Dr. Sarah Kapnick, NOAA's Chief Scientist, Camille Crane, the BRIC Section Chief at FEMA, and Blake Nanny, the Manager of Federal Relations at the American Institute of Architects. So let's dive into the questions first off, and we'll turn to you, Sarah. So how is weather and climate information used before, during, and after extreme events to build resilience?
Yeah, so way before an event happens, there's an understanding of what the risks and exposure are from physical climate. Right before events, we have forecasting. NOAA's providing forecasting of events, early warning systems. So that helps you figure out how to get your workers in place, how to get your plan set up for an event, how to prepare. Then during event, we give information about how long that event is going to last. So you know how to prepare, how to deal with it, how to continue to deal with it, either in crisis mode, an extreme event, or during a heat wave or during a drought. How are you changing your operations to be able to handle that? And then after event, particularly if there's damage as an event, there needs to be a rebuilding effort. And so as we understand climate change and its physical effects on our built environment, there needs to be rethinking around not building back to exactly the way things were, but thinking about climate change, about the current risks of events and how those risks are going to unfold over time and the lifetime of that infrastructure or those buildings, to be able to build it to be resilient for future events as well.
No, that's perfect. And as all of you know, I mean, one of the things that was critical as the IIJA went forward was to focus on modernizing infrastructure across the various modes and purposes of that infrastructure, from water to energy and transportation. Camille, do you want to pick up a little bit? I have a specific question for you, but also, do you want to pick up a little bit on that data question and how FEMA might use that as the BRIC program goes forward?
Sure, and I'll expand it to more than BRIC, although being the BRIC section chief, I like to talk about it most. when we're talking about using data, one of the things that all of our grant programs inside the hazard mitigation space at FEMA use or kind of have as a foundation is hazard mitigation planning. And planning is that community's opportunity to really look at what are their risks and vulnerabilities in the community as it relates to natural hazards, and then what to do about it. And also really looks at what are those key important partnerships and who has responsibility. I really appreciated what Secretary Mayorkas talked about the majority of infrastructure. He was relating to cyber. We see this for all infrastructure is actually owned by the private sector. So I think from hazard mitigation plans and other planning opportunities is really a chance to use the data, whatever that best available is, whether it's available through NOAA or other federal or state or local agencies, to really start that conversation at that lowest level about what is really our risk here and how do we mitigate those? What kind of projects do we need to do? As we had the first year of BRIC in FY20, a lot of those 22 projects that were selected in competition, we could see that they had been years in planning. They had really big or robust teams of partners that came together to really understand what are the risk in the community, not just today, but tomorrow. We're really focusing in the BRIC program on not just mitigating current risks, but having communities look at future conditions, whether that is from climate or demographic changes or land use changes, to understand where their community's going and what are the risks that they need to, so that they're not just investing to kind of mitigate what's now, but how can they make sure their community is resilient going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. Do you want to take that a little forward and talk about other hazard mitigation programs that are available to communities from FEMA?
Absolutely, because right now it's an unprecedented amount of money, as you talked about. Victoria Salinas, who is our head of resilience at FEMA, talked about on Wednesday, I believe. Right now, in just our hazard mitigation programs, assistant programs, of which there's about 5 across our suite. There's about $9 billion available to communities and states and tribes and territories to do projects or to do kind of capacity and capability building to lead them to mitigation projects. We were very excited that the president announced in the last couple weeks the $2.295 billion that will be available for the BRIC program in FY22. We are about a couple weeks away from actually announcing that program and putting out our notice of funding availability. You talked about the IIJA. That $2.295 billion only contains about $183 million of IIJA money, but that's there's $5 billion in IIJA for our programs across hazard mitigation. The biggest plus-ups we're getting is in our flood mitigation assistance. So that's $3.5 billion over 5 years. So you're going to see a major buildup of our flood mitigation assistance program. We have the STORM program, which is FEMA's first revolving loan program. That got funded at $500 million over the next 5 years. BRIC got the plus up of an additional $1 billion over 5 years, so we're taking that first $183 million and putting it into the program for this year. And then I can't leave out our biggest program, which is our hazard mitigation grant program. It rolled out last August, $3.46 billion. Every state got a declaration, which was the first time that every state in the country at one time had a funding opportunity through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And that $3.46 billion represents about 22% of that history of that program's funding. And that program's been around for about 30 years. So really, right now is an unprecedented time in the amount of mitigation money that FEMA has to make available. I think that really stresses the importance of partnerships, especially how the private sector can help. These are small communities that are seeing large influx of money being available, and it's really an opportunity right now to make that successful. And so they're going to need all the help. I appreciate the talk about technical assistance. We care a lot about that at FEMA, and we're looking how to expand our technical assistance we offer, but we know we can't do it alone. And so helping communities really take advantage of this opportunity that is right now with all this funding is key.
No, that's perfect. And it shouldn't go without being said that that amount of funding is truly transformational for both companies and communities to build resilience, thinking ahead of the next disaster, looking at lifeline infrastructure of things like water, energy, food, and health. I think, really key opportunities for all of us. So thanks so much, Camille. I want to turn to you, Blake. What recommendations do you have on how we might improve federal resilience programs?
It's a good question, Chuck, and it's something that at AIA we've been thinking a lot about and working with other coalition partners to advance some federal policies that have to run through Congress and turn into law to really make some key changes. One of the legislative items that we've been talking about a lot lately is the Resilient America Act, and that's a bipartisan piece of legislation that we support for a number of reasons. And generally, it takes a closer look at and tries to improve the state of pre-disaster mitigation instead of just reacting post-disaster. The bill does a number of great things on that front. It provides more flexibility and transparency to states and localities and local communities to better prepare ahead of time. It increases BRIC allocation significantly. Currently, right now, there is a 6% set aside from BRIC allocation specifically for pre-disaster mitigation. This bill would increase that more than double, up to 15%, and we think that's a real positive direction to go to prepare ahead of time. Another great provision in this bill that's very important to architects specifically is that there's a separate set aside for the FEMA administrator to utilize to support states and localities and local communities to adopt latest building codes. And for AIA and architects, we have long advocated that building code adoption and building up to more recent editions of those codes is one of the most effective methods of preparing your building and the built environment broadly to withstand natural disaster threats and to also be energy efficient and sustainable. So we often lead in our advocacy when we're talking to folks on the Hill or administration staff. Some of the stellar reporting, incredible reporting that the National Institute of Building Sciences produces in their Mitigation Saves report that found that for every $1 invested into efforts to get a building up to the most recent building code, that returns around $11 on that investment if and when a disaster does strike. And as architects, we understand those upfront costs of getting up to code, whether through a new construction project or a substantial retrofit, that has a cost factor, right? That does cost a lot of money, and that weighs on people's decision making. But when you're thinking about a country and an environment where for a lot of buildings, it's not so much a question of if, but when a disaster will happen, it's something that we think is really prudent and smart policy. So we definitely like to see that in the bill. The Resilient America Act also lends greater focus to other natural disaster risk other than just floods. Things like tsunamis, which I guess could be considered a flood, but also ice storms, wildfires, and things like that. So just want to close this one out, Chuck, by commending the Chamber of Commerce, the Build Strong Coalition, ICC, and others that I'm sure I'm not mentioning here on their great work and leadership in moving that bill along.
And we should certainly mention that that bill overwhelmingly passed the House of Representatives with a wide bipartisan margin, and now looking to see how we can move it in the Senate. So would want to work with all of you to see if we can't make that happen. Turning back to you, Sarah, on the issue of equity, how do you at NOAA ensure that there is access to information that can support communities in the equity discussion?
Yeah, so NOAA is producing the data sets that we produce the forecasts, we produce the seasonal predictions for a couple of months, then we also produce the long-term information from global climate models on the future of climate. And then we also house past data, the historical data, so you know where you've been, how things are going. To ensure that we have equity, we are trying to make these tools and the data sets more usable and usable to a broad, wide group of people. Before this role as chief scientist, I was working at a bank, and large corporations, they can have consultants in-house or climate scientists in-house or have consulting firms help them. But for small businesses, for communities, that often isn't a capability that they have. And so NOAA has been building different one-stop shops for these different types of hazards to get the information there and then partnering with other partner agencies. So last week, for example, We launched heat.gov. FEMA was one of our partners in that, as was CDC, National Institute of Health. It provides all the information on the forecasting of extreme heat, understanding how to deal with extreme heat, how to use it in your business operations to make sure that we protect lives during that time, and then also information about heat into the future for planning for business operations, but then also planning for infrastructure for that heat. One of the things that I've been surprised at people's reactions to last year during the Pacific Northwest heat wave, and then this summer again during the heat wave in London, roads were buckling, runways were melting. And so people have been really surprised by how extreme heat doesn't just affect people, it also affects our infrastructure. And so thinking about that for the future and having access to all that information is really critical for planning. So heat.gov as of last week.
And Chuck, if you don't mind, I'd like to add in, because Secretary Mayorkas talked about Justice 40 as being a couple of our programs, both the BRIC program and the flood mitigation assistance, are pilot programs under the effort to make sure at least 40% of our benefits go towards disadvantaged populations. And equity in the FEMA strategic plan is one of our key priorities through the 22-26 strategic plan, making sure that we look at equity throughout our operations in FEMA. And that's something, we've been doing a lot of research into and trying to make sure that our program has as few barriers as possible to entry. We're doing research, one, to understand the context that we live in, so I appreciate, Sarah, what you're talking about. That has to do with the data and understanding where people live and who's living and where are their challenges. And then we're looking at procedurally how our program is administered and what are those pain points throughout the process that are denying access to certain populations they can't enter, and how we can modify. That's one wonderful thing about the BRIC program, I think, is we're built on this model of continuous improvement. And part of that is we have some flexibilities in certain elements of our program. We can change from year to year. And so we can look at our results and say, okay, that we didn't achieve what we wanted, or we really got this part, so that's something we want to double down on. And we'll be very soon announcing our selections for the $1 billion we had available last year. I'm hoping that will happen next week. And with that, we've been looking at where these selections are going and what, we have a measure now to report out as pertains to Justice 40. So we'll be able to say, okay, looking at the data standards we have and the data available, we were able to direct these selections to certain communities, and we're excited to be able to share that results next week, hopefully.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
Yeah, something else I wanted to add is NOAA sits under Department of Commerce, where we also have census and census data. And so increasingly, we're also including census information to understand those exposures to extreme heat, and also including more county-level information to understand exposures at the county level. And with NOAA's $1 billion disaster program, most recently, we also put out that information of $1 billion disasters that are happening across the United States at the county level as well. So there can be more granular information about where these issues are happening, what the damages are, what the future exposures are, so then we can use all that information in all of our planning.
And unfortunately, those $1 billion disasters are ever increasing. Blake, I want to turn to you because I'm glad that both Sarah and Camille raised these issues. But in particular, if you can talk about other policies that might support underserved communities, and I know that we want to highlight the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act, which also talks about the kind of this connection with census information. So,
yeah, happy to, Chuck. And I'm glad you mentioned CDRS, which, as Chuck said, stands for the Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act. That's another bipartisan bill, and we think that's a promising policy out there that could really go a long way to tailor federal resources to where they're needed most, especially economically disadvantaged communities and communities that have been that way for a long time, yet reside in a high-risk area that's prone to a natural disaster. The bill does a number of things. As I think I mentioned, it is bipartisan, which is always great when you're working with Congress. But it establishes a new classification of a community disaster resilience zone. And if a said community is classified as such, it opens up greater technical assistance directly from the federal government. And Camille, as you were mentioning, that's just one of the key barriers for a lot of these communities who there's money out there, but if they don't have a lot of staff or capacity to make those applications on a technical level, they can miss out. So we want to, this bill would help with that. It's interesting how they classify the CDRZ communities, and it's really smart, kind of taking a page out of the book from what often insurance companies use and insurance groups to see where the most risk is, depending on the natural disaster risk of a given area, and then looks at the socioeconomic level of the area as well. And then, as such, if a community is labeled and classified as CDRZ, it also opens up additional federal cost sharing, which is we think is a savvy way to help folks put up some of the money to make the commitments they need to make their infrastructure and communities more resilient. And just as a snapshot, if folks aren't familiar with kind of federal cost sharing programs, as an example, sometimes there may be a grant program where the federal government will provide 50% of the funding, and then the local community, for example, might have to provide the other 50%. This bill would essentially increase what the federal government would put up front to lessen that economic burden on those folks who are identified.
And in the original language, it's 100% of the funding would be a federal grant. There is discussion in the Senate of a potential 90-10 split. I think that's something we're trying to encourage, that that because we're focusing on the most vulnerable populations, that we do indeed make that 100. It still remains to be seen how that's going to proceed in the Senate. So we're again, that's another issue to be working on. Camille, you touched kind of on public-private partnerships. Talk a little bit about kind of engaging with private and nonprofit entities and how that might support your capacity building efforts.
Sure. So we know that for reference, for all of our grant programs in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance, so whether it's BRIC or FMA or HMGP, or I should say, well, HMGP actually does have nonprofits, but anyway. For BRIC and FMA, we have states, territories, tribes, and local governments that can apply to the program. But, so who did I not say? I didn't say private citizens, academia, nonprofits, and private sector. They cannot apply to BRIC. But we absolutely can do resilience or mitigation projects with those entities. But to do that, they have to partner with a local government. So we mitigate, for example, private property all the time, but homeowners might work with their county, who then applies to the state that applies to FEMA. So just from the kind of the beginning, partnerships are important, because so much of the things that need to be mitigated around the country are not owned by government units. They're owned by private sector, they're owned by private citizens, they're owned by nonprofits or academia. So there has to be, from a very genesis, that planning to even get into the grant program. I think as you talk about the capacity. So we're talking a lot about all this funding that's coming into communities right now, and that infrastructure, especially those small communities and their capacity and capability to be able to manage it. I think nonprofits and private sector can lend a lot of technical assistance, and that can actually, I appreciate the talk about match. So right now, like in the BRIC program, we have a standard match across our program, same for FMA, of 75% federal, 25% non-federal. That non-federal can be cash, but it also can be in-kind services or professional services that are donated from private nonprofits and private sector. A lot of our projects are in BRIC are infrastructure-based. So they're technical solutions, they're engineered solutions. So how can private sector or nonprofits, academia too, help communities both write those applications? It's a very competitive process for BRIC. Our first year, we were 7 times oversubscribed for the funding we had available. We doubled the amount of funding we have available. We were still 4 times oversubscribed. We're doubling the program again this year. We'll see if we still have an oversubscription or not. But they're competitive. So I've looked at some of the selected applications from that first year, and they had help writing their grant applications from academia. So you can tell it was folks that really helped them come in and understand kind of the nuances, because these are peer-reviewed applications, so they read really well. So I think there's places that they can help, whether it's in the technical assistance, whether it's the engineering part of it, whether it's the professional writing of the grant, of the match, whether that's cash or that's in-kind services from doing some of those things. From the front end, we actually can fund in the BRIC program partnership development, because we understand that either to get some of these big projects done, you're going to have a committee or a community of professionals putting them together. So we can actually give partnership funding to a community to help them build those relationships, because so much needs to happen kind of on the front end in figuring out which projects need to come forward or which projects best mitigate the solution. I think we are at unprecedented time right now, both in the kind of urgency to complete this mitigation work or to complete this resilience work matched with the funding needed, that it's really going to take everyone coming together. Not only I would say for the BRIC program or even the FEMA programs, but right now all the federal agencies have so much money available. And I come from a town of, I appreciate also Secretary Marcus talking about Mayfield, Kentucky. I'm from a neighboring community in Kentucky, a population 900, the town I grew up in. And I can imagine my town mayor sitting there going, what is happening right now, right? Like, there is so much money coming on, and can someone help me? And I can remember I worked for the state of Kentucky before I joined FEMA, and they got a grant through FEMA, but it was very much because they had the help of their area development district coming in and kind of going, okay, let's suss out kind of what are the requirements and putting that together. So I think that's as much ability and capability that the academia, nonprofit, and private sector have right now to help these communities build resilience is super key.
Yeah, and just to add on that, seeing as IIJA has been such a windfall of opportunities, that's something that our state and local team at AIA has been trying to partner with our members out in the states and localities to kind of connect those dots on those opportunities as they come out. So just wanted to add that.
Well, an important role, and want to talk a little bit about the important role of the states in those decisions across the IIJA funding portfolio. So I think that should be underscored in particular on these decisions as well. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about how NOAA partners with companies and other, and with the business community on these issues in particular?
Yes, we have several different levels of it. So first we have our SBIR program, which provides grants to small businesses related to NOAA's mission and science. So those are the small seed funding that gets those companies up and started. We then have CRADAs, where we do partnerships with businesses, it can also be with universities and others, around joint development around research programs, and we have several of those. Right now. And then also under this administration, we've really made an effort for better outreach. Our head of NOAA, Dr. Rick Spinrad, has gone out and has met with over 150 companies so far this year, or in the past year, and holding also listening sessions on discussions around what are the issues people face, what are the type of data sets they need, how do those data sets need to be formatted or provided to them, what should the websites look like, the interfaces, and then also how do we provide guides of how to use the information, how to get that information into decision makers so they can make those decisions more informed from the science that we're producing. And from all of this, we're trying to make sure that we, through our authority of providing the predictions, the projections, all the weather and climate information that we produce, that we are making sure that it's getting in the hands of businesses to be able to make those decisions. And so we're constantly improving upon that. Instead of just putting the data out there and assuming that people will just find it, we're trying to make it more user-friendly, trying to have that engagement to make sure that it is being uptaken right now.
Well, and I'm sure that that there's a bill in Congress now that called the Water Data Act to set up a federal framework for sharing that data and making sure that the federal agencies can work across uniform sets. So can you talk a little bit of why that's so important and how that works kind of in this space of reducing climate risk?
Yeah. People need to be able to have access to these authoritative data sets. They need to be able to find them. They need to be able to use them. And so part of that is being able to create the framework from which that all comes from, the standards, to be able to understand it and use it.
Really appreciate that. That's something, at the Chamber we've been talking about for quite a while. How do we ensure that the USG is working together on these issues, because the private sector in looking for, what's that bright line where we can provide service back to the federal government on those products and services that can use that those raw data sets. So really important, in particular in this space. Camille, want to turn back to you on to dive more into the BRIC Direct Technical Assistance Programs, to talk a little bit about that and what you're thinking about next steps there.
Absolutely. So BRIC, when we first think about BRIC, if you think about BRIC at all, you think about the funding and the doubling that keeps happening, right? Our first year of 500, it was a double of the most pre-disaster mitigation money that was ever put out by FEMA through the PDM program was $250 million, and that was actually, hint, BRIC funding, because we were still building the program. But then the first year of BRIC, we doubled that for 500. The next year, billion. The next year, what the president just announced, 2.295. But we also knew, back in 2019, we did a heavy stakeholder engagement to do the design of the BRIC program. It had 5,000 non-attributable individual comments, more than 70 agency letters. Largest stakeholder engagement FEMA ever did on any effort was led through the BRIC program. And what we heard is, sometimes we just need help. Right? Like, your grant applications are hard. We need some technical assistance. We're not ready for a grant. So we intentionally built a piece of the program that has nothing to do with the money at all. It's actually called Non-Financial Direct Technical Assistance. We acronym everything, so we say DTA. But it is an offering that we have through the program that a community does not have to complete a grant application. They just put forward a request. The first couple of years, we did it through a letter, through an email inbox. We are going to move to a form on a website to be a little bit more technically savvy, I guess, for us to be able to record data. But it's basically just it's just a community saying, I need some help, and here's the area I need help in. For the first year of the program, we did 8 communities around the country, because this was kind of our first kind of wading ourselves in. So right now, we are actively working with 8 communities across the country on we left the aperture pretty open. They could request anything. So, for example, we're working with a tribe in, I think it's Montana, that had a grant and they're just struggling to close it out. And we care about the implementation of these projects, not just the application, but the actual completion of them, and making sure a community doesn't have their money recouped because they didn't follow certain procurement laws. So we're working with the tribe there. We're working with Thomasville, Georgia, down in the southern part of Georgia, to really help them with both the education of mitigation, technical project scoping, partnership development, doing several different things with them. We looked at the second year of the program. We said we want to increase that. And so we removed a couple of barriers in how communities could apply. They could now apply directly to FEMA. They don't have to go through any other agency. Our request went from 12 the first year to 100 the second year. We were able to choose 20 in May, and we just had a call in June to kind of kick off with those 20 communities. And we're really, if you look at the IIJA, it really stresses the importance of technical assistance, and that the federal governments offer, or the federal agencies, I should say, offer technical assistance. So we're doing an examination of how we do direct technical assistance. We're looking at how we can dramatically increase and scale up. We're looking at how we can offer it, because right now we do very high touch with each individual community. We're seeing that, learning through that a lot of communities need the same thing. So how can we group them to be able to offer to more? We're expanding the number of partners. Right now, all of our technical assistance is done through FEMA staff. So we're looking at how we can build that network of providers that can provide that technical assistance. Really, throughout this fall, we're going to be doing a re-examination of the effort to see. We've been challenged by Administrator Chris Well of FEMA to really see how can we explode it, let's just say, offer it so much more than we currently are, and how we can make it more of a continuous offering for a community. So that's kind of our vision of where we would like to take the direct technical assistance within the BRIC program, that it's not just an annual offering, but it's a constant or continuous offering that a community can come to us at any time, and we can put them on a path wherever they are across a kind of a life cycle of mitigation. But more to come on that, hopefully, over the next, we'll be announcing what DTA looks like a little bit on a webinar we're doing on August 4th, so you can register right now for that webinar. We start our webinar series August 4th, and it'll go throughout the month of August and September and into October. But that's our first webinars on building capacity and capability. And then throughout the fall, we'll be kind of modularizing, I think is what we're going to call it, direct technical assistance.
So just two quick comments. One is, I know that other agencies through the IIJA are looking to do the same thing, so would certainly encourage that there's collaboration across the federal family. And then second, how can we at the chamber be helpful there? I know our members, our state and local chambers can serve as resources as that goes forward, and so would be pleased to see how that might work going forward.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Want to turn to you, Blake. I know that we had talked a little bit about kind of the notion of elevation, let's backing up to 30,000 feet. What are the ways in which we can get good policy in place? There is a bill called the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act, which does a few key things to do that. So want to turn to you on that.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Chuck. And as Chuck mentioned, we call that bill NCARS, or NCARS Act, and it does a lot of great things to ensure that the federal government and each of the respective agencies are better integrated and coordinated and talking apples to apples instead of apples to oranges all the time as it relates to resilience planning. It also creates a chief resilience officer within the White House to direct and lead those efforts, and we think that's a positive direction forward. I will say that AIA has not endorsed that bill yet. We've been working with the Senate staff on some key changes to the legislation, and just as a quick snapshot of what the issue is for us, within the bill text, there is it defines the word resilience within it, and we took a really close look at that within our policy team and within our disaster resilience architect experts within AIA, and we didn't really have concerns with how the definition was written itself, but we did identify concerns that there's just so many existing resilience definitions in use across the federal government. In our research earlier this year, we found no less than 12 distinct and different resilience definitions being currently used across various federal agencies. So we've been working with Senate staff to insert some language to encourage that chief resilience officer to work to standardize some of those resilience definitions across the board to help states and localities better understand what they need to do.
Well, thank you so much. We're at time and a little bit over. I want to first say I apologize for not getting to your questions. Technically, I'm challenged, and so couldn't figure out the iPad. So we'll gather those questions and see if we can't get back to you on those. But want to thank the panel and ask you to give them a big hand of applause and thank them as well. Thank you so much.
All right, so everyone likes to network. We have 20 minutes to network, 10:20. Please be back here for the next panel. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I think I have the task of trying to get you back from break. Hope everyone had a nice break and is having a nice day. This is a panel on building partnerships for when systems fail. And so we're going to talk both about systems that fail and partnerships and how those partnerships can come together and improve our chances to, first of all, keep systems from failing, and second of all, deal with them as they fail. I'm Bob Kolaski. Currently, I'm a Senior Vice President for Critical Infrastructure at Exeger. Exeger is a third-party risk analysis, risk management company. We do a lot of work on supply chain analytics, which is near and dear to my heart. Spent a number of years at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and its predecessor, most recently working with Elena and running the National Risk Management Center over there. And so I'm excited to be here. I love a good public-private partnership conference where last year I was on the public side, this year I'm on the private side, and I think that's probably true for a number of you, that you've had exposure on both sides of the public-private divide. In terms of who's on the panel today, Elena Clark, who's at CISA. She runs the Stakeholder Engagement Division and is a longtime former colleague, has been at the department for a number of years. Matt Hayden, another former colleague who's currently at GDIT, and I'll let Matt talk a little bit about what he's doing. Doug Baker at FMI, the Food Institute, and Penny Nefaris, who's with JetBlue. And please stay to the end because Penny is going to make it worth your while to stay at the end. So let me go with a little bit of an icebreaker here. I want to learn a little bit about what your roles are in dealing with system risks that could be systemic and partnerships. But let's do it in the lens of what risks are you really spending your time thinking about? At CISA, when we were working, we had a risk register that had 5 topics. Climate change, cybersecurity, supply chain risks, terrorism risks, pandemic risks, and you know, a lot of the work that spent my time in government and still spend my time thinking about are those sort of risks. Those are the things that could cause systems to fail. So maybe I'll start, Elena, with a question on, you know, how are you thinking about those risks? Which one is top of mind for you, and what are you doing day to day to address mitigating those risks?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me. So I think I'll start with cyber. So I think this, especially in the current environment that we are in after the past couple of years with COVID and going to a completely virtual environment, and now we're back to more of a hybrid environment, current geopolitical tensions that have been ongoing for almost 8 months now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then also adding on to the past couple of years, you've got cyber actors that are watching this environment with everybody immediately going to virtual. The risks that come with that, maybe not everybody being completely prepared to go to virtual, and exploiting those vulnerabilities and exploiting those entities, whether it's small and medium businesses or our state and local partners, and kind of going after them as well. So cybersecurity, I would say, has been a top priority. I know you heard the director talk about it yesterday, and the secretary talk about it today as well. So that is one area that I myself am spending a lot of time with our private sector partners, with our state and local partners, and others on at the agency.
Matt Hayden. So just a quick intro. My job at GDIT is to be both a cyber evangelist and a cyber explainer on both sides of the fence. So I actually love what I do. At the same time, when we talk about the 5 risks, of course, the default answer is all of them. But I'm going to cheat and use 2. When we look at supply chain and cyber, it's both. We, as a cyber offerer, want to make sure that we eat our own dog food. We're working really hard to make sure if there's an advanced solution, we're showing off. But we can't do that if any of our suppliers are our weak link. So we have to dig down, and luckily now that there are software offerers that give us that visibility into 3rd and 4th, even 5th level supply chain, we can communicate with all of them and say, hey, this is our expectation of what cyber is, because we can't have a bad day. Because we have a bad day, our customers have a bad day, and our customers are Uncle Sam. And so we have a big challenge on our hands. So cyber gets our primary focus, but we don't get to just look in the mirror. We have to go through our full supply chain to do just that.
Doug?
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Doug Baker. I'm with FMI, and we're a national trade association of food retailers and product manufacturers. So I want to say E, but I know everybody's going to go supply chain, right? It's the closest thing to the consumer, and it's probably what's been above the fold on every newspaper for the last 2.5 years. And the thing that we were challenged with running into the pandemic and then continue to be is that we built one of the most efficient food supply chains in the world. Just-in-time inventory systems were fantastic for a lot of reasons, keeping costs down, reducing food waste. And then we ran into this buzzsaw that required us to have a just-in-case inventory system. And so we're spending a lot of time as an industry really talking about how do we get somewhere in between. Because just in case, you're going to see a whipsaw effect come this holiday where retailers have just purchased and purchased and purchased, and now buying is starting to decline. So from a pricing standpoint, that'll be a benefit. From a waste standpoint, that's not going to be so great. So for us and several of our members, which are single store operators up to Walmart, Amazon, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, it's really talking about how do we build this resilient supply chain that has the ability to adapt to the many influences that we're currently feeling, whether it be cyber, food safety, food protection. We have a lot of bad actors that find their way into our supply chain, and I could give you some stories over a drink sometime. They're pretty amazing. But it's never ending. So I'd still go back to E, but supply chain is consumer facing.
Good morning, everyone. Penny from JetBlue. So our team does all the crisis planning, exercises, and response. And so I'd say maybe corporately what we're focused on, and then also industry. So corporately, I think about our business partners. I think you're hearing a theme, right? And so we may do everything we can to be as resilient as possible, but you're just as weak as your weakest link out there. And so we've sat at the table with several business partners that are like, we've never been asked to do a disaster recovery test. Why are you asking us that? So that's a big focus for us from our BC disaster recovery team. From an industry perspective, I think about infrastructure and just our airspace and the ability to handle more flights and more planes and how fragile it is, as well as with workforce, right now, some of the challenges that we're up against. So some of it is corporate and some of it is industry, but we're all laser focused on all those topics.
Great. Well, thanks. And at this point, it's not a controversial statement, and it won't be for this panel to say partnerships are part of the element of addressing the risks of concern. I mean, interesting couple, you talk about partnerships in terms of actually a business relationship and partnership. It's more than a friendship, it's a business relationship too. I'm interested, let's dive a little bit deeper from each of your views on what makes a successful partnership. What are the elements of a successful partnership? How has your thinking evolved about that over time as you've tried to cultivate these partnerships for these purposes? And, I'll
jump in. All right. So the easy answer is an outcome that both parties value. And when it came time to talk about why not share cyber indications, you've got a thing on your network you've seen, it may be bad, you're worried about telling someone else because you don't want to let somebody know that something's bad on your network. That is an important value add to a whole community so that no one else has to feel that same way, and also has the ability to see that in their eyes and to prevent it from their network. So information sharing has to have that all boats rise together mentality, and without that, we have a challenge on our hands. So when we look at successful partnerships, like the work that's going on in CISA, like the work that we're seeing out of all of our agencies that are talking to us, we have to make sure that the outcomes of that partnership are where we see where both sides want to go. It can't feel like a regulatory environment, even if it is a regulatory environment. It has to feel like we're looking out for all of our necks, and that's where it really lends itself. And that also spends its way down into the communities where our industry partners are working, because when we talk to local cities and all the way down to the municipality level, they want to make sure we're just as successful as they are. And so it's that common outcome, common values that really shares and makes it successful.
The one thing I would add to that, which great answer, is I was thinking trust and transparency. Especially within our industry, everybody's a competitor of somebody. But in the importance to be able to do that data sharing, you've got to build that trust and that transparency in order for you to be able to make actionable results out of those data points. We, at the beginning of the pandemic, as one example, food service, right? We saw it shut down completely, and grocery retail was struggling to keep up. And so we immediately reached out to the International Food Distributor Association, and started working with them to start moving that food service food over to retail. And it took a lot. It took, waivers from FDA. It took repackaging. It took turning lines over so that we could get that food to where it needed to be. And we weren't 100% successful, as everybody saw on the TV, but we were able to divert a lot of that food. And prior to the pandemic, you would have never seen a grocery person and a restaurant person in the same room, let alone sharing labor, sharing trucking, sharing facilities, buying from each other. So it was sort of trial by fire, but trust and transparency really sort of drives that.
Elena?
And to add from the CISA perspective, and I apologize, I forgot at the top to actually say what I do at CISA. I'm our Assistant Director for Stakeholder Engagement, so this is really at the heart of what I'm doing every day, whether it's with the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, with the directors, boards, and councils, with our international partners. So this is basically the foundation of what CISA is built on. It's a voluntary partnership, so it's built on trust. The other thing that CISA has is about 500 to 600 field staff. So they're in the communities because this is not happening completely out of DC. So we need to have our staff building those relationships within the communities with you, with your companies, to make sure that there is that trust there. And I think one example of how we really operationalize this was through the work that we did through our Shields Up campaign over the past 8 months. Before we came out with Shields Up, we were engaging with industry and with our state and local partners, talking with them about what we were seeing and the concerns that we had about what would potentially materialize. And because of that trust, they were able to make operational changes, and then we were able to go out with Shields Up. So it's a great example about the trust that we built and how we were then able to operationalize that with our partners.
Can I ask you a quick question, just because I'm interested, and I know you don't hate me? Tell this question. Stakeholder engagement division, we're at a partnership conference. Do those words mean different things, stakeholder and partnership, or are they, in your mind, synonyms? And any thought on why you chose to lead with stakeholders?
I came into stakeholders, so I don't know if I always enjoyed stakeholder because I like partnership better, but I think they also mean the same thing because, quite frankly, it has to be a partnership. There has to be trust. But yeah, I came into the name for stakeholder engagement after CISA created it.
Good. Okay, Penny, any thoughts on what makes a successful partnership?
Yeah, so, we've heard it over and over again. This is the time, not in the middle of a crisis is really hard to develop that relationship. And I'll just give you an example. We're planning a company-wide full-scale exercise, right? We're simulating an airplane accident. We are partnering with Providence, Rhode Island Airport. Anyone and everyone can come. So we are reaching out to the police, the hospitals, the Red Cross, anybody that can learn from this. Was at an MIT course on Monday, and the Coast Guard was one of the students in the class that I taught at, and was like, can I come? Of course you can come. And so, again, making those relationships and learning from each other so that if the crisis does happen, we've been there, we've been at the table, we've had the talk, we worked through some of the challenges. That's incredibly important. So from a private sector standpoint, getting as many players to play with you or engaging in your exercises or you engaging in them is critical. It's a key part of our program.
So I like that answer a lot. How have you thought about, and do you lose any sleep over in the new hybrid environment we're all working in today, some of the less, fewer opportunities for in-person contact, fewer opportunities to be in the room together? Is it just a matter of different technical solutions to the same things we were doing, or are you concerned that maybe there won't be as many human-level partnerships while we are operating in a hybrid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our pilots still show up, which is a good thing. No, so, but I think from our standpoint, the connection can be virtual, right? Teams has been a great substitution, but now that we are a little bit more in person, we have been driving up to meet people, in person. I think there is something to that connection. As far as our capabilities and response, it's still in person. Like, we need you in the command center. I can't have you running this crisis from your bedroom. So, so from that aspect, it's still in person and engagement. But it is an interesting formula because I think it does allow for what capabilities can you do remote, and it does help from that aspect, right? Are there capabilities that could be done remote and help your plan?
Mm-hmm. Can I add to that? One thing that I've kind of thought about coming into this role, it was 100% virtual. And we're finally getting back to a hybrid environment. And it's great on the virtual side because I've connected with individuals and entities that I might never have connected with before. But the concern I have is it doesn't replace that in-person connection. And I personally like more, smaller, intimate settings so that somebody can get to know me, I can get to know them, and that's really where the trust is. And it's not always those conversations about work, but it's getting to know them on a personal level. So for me, I really want to get back out there and start to meet individuals and companies in person because you just can't replace that.
Elena, in your earlier answer, when you're talking about Shields Up, CISA's campaign around cyber defense in the face of the Russian attack on Ukraine, you used the word operationalizing the partnership. And that's always been, I think, a goal, is to take these partnerships that Penny talked about that are established and make sure that in the moment where you actually have to work shoulder to shoulder, you operationalize the collaboration. Where are we generically in terms of have the partnerships you've been involved in? I mean, Doug, you were talking about new partnerships. Have they been operationalized? Is that no longer something that we have to say is something for the future? But we have all at this point operationalized the partnerships we care about.
So I think the past couple of months really tested the relationships that we had on a couple fronts. And the director mentioned this and the secretary did as well. But the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, it had just stood up. The initial plan was to do defense planning, but then Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we immediately had to shift and start working hand in hand with some of the biggest ISPs, CSPs, and cyber vendors to understand what they were seeing within their holdings, what the government was seeing, and how we could, over, as the director said, a very sophisticated Slack channel, how we were in live time, we were sharing information. So we were truly operationalizing it, and not all of industry had to be a partner of JCDC to have that reduction of risk at scale, because we were then able to share back out to the entire community of partners what we were seeing, and it might not have called out JCDC for developing it, but we were really able to share back out with industry partners, with our state and local partners, with our international partners, what we were seeing, advices and steps that they should be taking on the operational side. So it was truly a test, I think, the past 8 months, and I'm really proud of what the government was able to do with industry and with our international and state and local partners, because I think we were able to protect our critical infrastructure here domestically, but also seeing what our international partners were able to do as well. It was truly amazing.
So I'll jump in and I'll give this for you to spike down later. So the National Critical Functions work was great. So we had CISA standing up all the different national critical functions and where they intersected and where those pinch points were. That's the type of work where you can get a lot more operational insight into the government to help them navigate some of these speed bumps that are out there. Right now, we don't have that fully mapped, I think, at least from the industry perspective. And that is where we would love to see some better operational consistency across government and industry to pull together where we can keep this one pinch point from knocking out 2, 3 sectors, and what can we do to harden or make that more resilient from there. And so when we say, is the operational partnership there? It's there. It's just we haven't used those tools to really push the envelope, to really get this ahead. Because if we turn to the great staff in government, they're going to be behind the 8 ball just from an understanding of context. It's not fair to turn to the government and say, understand my systems without me telling you what my systems are. And so there's that operational relationship that exists that just hasn't been really honed to nail all those just yet.
Yeah, I would say for our particular business, they're growing, they're improving, and we're finding new ones all the time. I would use IDA as an example. Some of the challenges that we still find is it's really important to get a grocery store up and running again as quickly as possible. Right? We don't really want FEMA dropping a pot in a parking lot of a grocery store that's actually open. So understanding, what is happening in the immediate impact area and surrounding impact area has been something we've worked on for several years with the NBOC and with All Hazards Consortium having a cross-sector partnership with telecoms, comms, electric, fuel. The other big challenge that we found during IDA was fuel, right? So if the grid's down, the grocery store's got to run on a generator. There's 36 hours basically before you got to refuel that, and then finding the fuel. So does diesel fuel, do you save it for the trucks, for the utility trucks? How do you separate that? Regular fuel, you got to have employees come into the store and work the store. But if they're waiting in a 3-hour line at a gas station to get fuel to be able to go to the grocery store to work it so people can come and buy food, it's a little bit counterproductive. So to your point on pinch points, we still have some that we're working through as an industry, but we do believe we've got the right people around the table and having the right conversations and building those roadmaps and those muscle memories. I've always said your body can't go where your mind's never been. And so we exercise it and exercise it just so that we can, when it finally happens, we might get there a little bit quicker.
Penny, I'm going to bring in the iPad question. It did pop up, so I'm happy for that. So score one for me facilitating as opposed to the last facilitator. And thank you to the Chamber Foundation. So you're talking about pinch points, and I think this is a good segue into this question. Which systems would you say are weakest, and what are tangible ways businesses can bolster the protocols and supply chains today? From JetBlue's perspective, do you see any weak systems out there that you'd like to see somebody else working on? Because I know you're taking care of your own systems.
You know, there is obviously a lot of effort for next gen and getting air traffic to the next level to make our airspace more efficient. So from a bigger picture, there's that. I also just think the industry as a whole, our technology is so antiquated. There's just not a lot of companies out there who want to build a reservation system. Like, you just don't make a lot of money off it. And so you're stuck with some, providers that are just, set in 1960. And so there's definitely a lot of opportunity. I think we're moving there. We're just a lot slower than a lot of other industries.
Let me just do a solid to Matt, and maybe you want to talk to him a little bit. GDIT might be out there ready to help. Doug, I saw you jump up on.
Yeah, the one thing that I was really thinking about is during the pandemic, we talked a lot about control tower, right? Red, yellow, green on the food supply chain. There's a conversation about the administration putting an Office of Supply Chain in. It's difficult at best. On a great day, it's still difficult because of the complexity of where the data sits. So the thing that I think we can do as an industry to make sure that all stakeholders have the information they need is to find standards, consistent nomenclature, consistent formats, interoperability, so we can share the information back and forth. The communities are in place. I see Kathy sitting over there. She's got a great community, and they meet frequently during crisis and deal with issues on the moment. I mentioned all hazards. So the communities are in place, but it's everybody's got a pet duck in the game, right? And my pet duck is perfectly fine. I don't need to change it, but we've all got to figure a way to come together to say, what are the basic blocking and tackling things we need to do to move the ball forward? And typically that's standards and nomenclature that you can at least coalesce around.
Pinch points, Elena?
I would say one would probably be on the workforce side, because we're all competing for the same cybersecurity workforce, whether that's state and local, the government, or industry. And unfortunately, your small and medium businesses and your localities can't pay the same as maybe the state, the private sector, or the government, U.S. government. So that, I think, is a big challenge in how do you get the next generation interested in cybersecurity, get them trained with the right skills, get them trained on the new systems, so that we can be competitive on a global scale. So that is a big priority, which is why you actually heard the secretary, I don't think the director mentioned it, but the partnership with the Girl Scouts of America. How do you get girls interested in the STEM field, in cybersecurity, so that they will want to do this? Because you've got to start young so that they know well before going into college that this is a field for them. And so I think that is something that we need to just continue to put more attention and time into.
Thanks, Elena. So when we were talking to Rob Glenn and the team who put together the description, Rob was saying he might have been a little overwrought in his writing up the description of the panel, but he put one thing in there, somebody on his team did, that I thought was an interesting question. Does the environment present insurmountable challenges to addressing the risks? And we're all talking about hard things, but progress that's been made. Where do you see challenges that are, if not insurmountable, not yet surmounted, in terms of really being where we need to be to deal with the systemic nature of the kinds of things we might see in the future that have come up. I mean, we haven't talked specifically a lot about climate impacts and some of the huge nature. That's just going to transcend a lot of the sectors we're talking about, a lot of the elements we're talking about. Where are the insurmountable challenges, and what should we be working hard to surmount right now?
I'll go back to my last answer. I would say it's the workforce. I mean, really, that is a challenge that we collectively have, and we've got to get more students interested in the cybersecurity field, because if we don't, we will not have the workforce to support these systems and these networks and be able to help secure them from a CISO perspective. Our nation state actors are very savvy, and we need the workforce to protect our network. So I think that is of a major concern, and we definitely need to be investing more in it.
And Matt, I'm sure GDIT, and you share, I know you share some of that same perspective. What do you, let's go further. Education matters, encouragement matters, but what else sort of on the business side can businesses do to help create the workforce of the future?
Well, first off, I'll say, as a dad of 3 daughters, I've become the cool dad in my family. So my wife is an attorney, I'm the cyber guy, so I'm doing my part. But at the same time, when we talk business challenges, it's a bigger issue about our actual C-suite really valuing, like, this is the workforce to develop. Because when you start at a large corporation, that no matter whether you're making submarines or you're making private jets, you have to have a cyber workforce, but you're in competition now with what the manufacturing demand or what they consider their primary reason for existing is. And we have, luckily over in GDIT, our business is cyber. So we have an awesome leadership team that's dedicated on this, participate in Girls Who Code, have an equal evangelist in our president. But the problem we find is that when we go outside of that cyber bubble, saying you needed to help us get this cyber workforce, they see it at the expense of another marketing officer, another human resources officer. They say, look, there's not enough people filling the jobs we've got for everything. So workforce is a challenge, but it's also a mentality that we have to fight. The same goes for cybersecurity budgets and cybersecurity empowerment across non-traditional cybersecurity actors as well.
Doug, you brought up workforce in our prep call, but I think not so much thinking about workforce from a cybersecurity skills, but other elements of the workforce. So maybe we'll pull in some other challenges associated with having the workforce necessary to deal with these potentially insurmountable challenges.
I mean, if you look at all of the issues that you saw in a grocery store on a store shelf, 9 times out of 10 you could trace that back to a human capital shortage. You know, whether that was because they were out with the virus or they've left the industry altogether. So, you know, workforce is a big topic for our industry and a big need for our industry, because at the end of the day, you can put in as much technology as you want, but it still comes back to people. People got to run the technology. I think the one thing that we see as an association and through our members is we need to do a much better job making people aware of the vastness of our industry and the opportunities that ride within it. How many people, when you ask them, what name a job in the grocery business, you say cashier, stocker, meat cutter, produce guy, right? But no, I was on a call yesterday with several IT security professionals, right? Lawyers, marketers, food scientists. It's an industry to make a career out of. And to your point, you know, cyber is becoming a bigger and bigger issue as we use technology to address workforce shortages, right? So how do we automate the supply chain? And every time you throw another piece of technology in that might be cloud-based, you're basically creating another window for a bad actor to get through. So those teams are going to have to be bolstered and grow in order to be able to manage all of that technology that the industry is putting in place, if we can't get the workforce to come back.
Yeah, I mean, obviously workforce is a challenge across the board. You know, I think we're all facing that. I do want to maybe just call out that the work that has been done in the U.S. is incredible, you know, and when I look around the table, this didn't exist 20 years ago, you know, and so I do feel really good about what the infrastructure is here and how to help us respond or get through the crisis. Where I'm more concerned about is we are global companies, and where we fly to, and it is our bread and butter, those nations can't recover, and how much resources we as private sector have to help them to get back on their feet. If a natural disaster happens, whatever the case may be. So that to me sometimes feels more insurmountable than something that maybe happens in the States, and maybe because I do have the network that I can call upon that can help.
Okay. Any other insurmountable challenges or not yet surmounted challenges? I'll patent that phrase.
I'll just add on to what Matt was saying about your C-suite and your board of directors. That's an area that CIS has identified of needing to do more outreach and engagement with, because if your company, it might not be a cybersecurity IT company, but making sure your C-suite, your board of directors understands how quickly a cybersecurity incident could take the company down, could bring you to a halt is really important. So we are trying to increase our engagement to that C-suite and those board of directors to educate them on what the questions that they should be asking, steps that they should be taking as well.
So with that, with some of the themes, and even going back to the workforce, right? The workforce right now, we live in almost a full employment environment. So presumably you have to incentivize people to work in different things with additional resources. You're talking about, Elena, sort of getting to the board because you want to get to the board because you want the board to invest more in cybersecurity and in corporate resilience and in other continuity, other aspects of this mission. And we've had a whole thing. This stuff costs money to be better at this. I mean, I guess I'll start with the question, and Matt, I'll throw it to you, and how you're thinking about the fact we are imposing a cost to be more resilient. Is that a fair way to think about it, or am I being too bottom line-ish? And so
And it's the same way you talk about is how expensive is a disruption, you know. And so we do leverage the alter ego of resilience in that conversation. And so when we talk about security by design, you're talking about if you don't build that security in, I don't care if you're making a camera or a watch that tells you how many steps you've taken, to harden it after the fact, when you get told it has to be secure, it can be up to 10 times more expensive. So having that upfront conversation about resilience, in that same analogy, whether it's in people, whether it's in making sure our buildings are designed to be resilient with alternate options in mind, all of that has to be put with a price tag. And so not doing it, you have to do that math as well. So no, it's not free. And then yes, it is expensive. And yes, it is not a fun conversation. But at the same time, the other side of the coin is a worse day. And so that's the pitch that has to come with a part of it.
And Doug, you certainly made that point in terms of moving from just in time. Let me add on this and maybe ask you this question. I agree with the theory, Matt, what you're saying. But what does that look for a key performance indicator? What is somebody at a business incentivized down past the C-suite level to deliver performance in this area, and how can we make this part of key performance indicators in a business environment?
To me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, that's a great question. And every time we talk about launching something new in the industry, we talk about the culture shift that is required in order to do that. And technology is a great example of that, right? I mean, the first thing a person thinks about is, oh, you're getting rid of my job, right? So it really does talk about, you know, starting from the top and working down. For us specifically, it's always putting the consumer in the center, though. That's our key performance indicator. And the best thing for a U.S. consumer is the amount of competition that's in our industry, right? Whether it be from a brands or from stores, whether online or brick and mortar, you have choices plentiful. And so whoever is able to cater to that consumer to make sure that they have an efficient and engaging experience is the one that's going to win, whether that's technology, people, process, whatever that is.
Penny, I'll let you weigh in this, but I also have a question here for JetBlue, so feel free to answer both. So the question here is, for JetBlue, you mentioned nations globally that you fly to not being able to recover. Are there investments you're making to help them get to the place of recovery? Are you helping other nations be more resilient?
Yeah, so for us, obviously we have a big market in the Caribbean. We actually have partnered with the Clinton Foundation to help them with some of the efforts that they're doing. Now, on an immediate scale, getting folks down into the island to help recover, whether it's response workers or supplies, you know, that's what we'll do immediate. But it goes beyond the first week or month. And that's where, you know, just partnering with the Clinton Foundation has helped us to do our part to maybe help educate or partner with helping get resources in to educate the local folks as well. So that's some of the work that we have been doing.
So let's see, what else do we still have to talk about? Elena, let me ask you, just to follow on the role of NGOs in this whole ecosystem. Penny just mentioned the Clinton Foundation, but I know CIS is also thinking about other non-governmental organizations, and how can non-governmental organizations help be part of this public-private partnership?
Sure, so they can just reach in a completely different audience than we might be reaching. So it is so important for us to be working with them, providing them any tools or capacity building recommendations that we would have. So as they're going into different communities, whether it's in the US or with allied nations as well, being able to share those types of best practices is key. And one thing we've been doing, at least on the international front, is working with those allied nations or nations that just don't have the same capabilities that we have, and ensuring that they're getting the resources and best practices that we have as well.
And Doug, going back to trust, we haven't talked that much on this panel on the role of citizens in this whole thing. Obviously, resilience is to benefit the citizenry in a lot of ways, and NGOs certainly help with different citizen communities. But where do these kind of public-private partnerships work with citizens in an environment where citizens have lost trust in institutions in so many different places, or there's such a bifurcation of which institutions citizens trust? Us all, the royal citizens. But so if trust and transparency are necessary for partnership at one level, hopefully we can do it amongst professionals. But what about professionals with the citizenry itself?
Yeah, I would go to an example. Several years ago, 2014, we kicked off a program called Smart Label. And it was because of the eroding trust from consumers in big brands. And so Smart Label today is a digital platform that brands can share more than can ever fit on a package to the general citizen and general consumer. So that's one area, is that brand reputation and trust that company stands for something, whatever that be. The other one is one that we're sort of experiencing today, unfortunately. Anywhere people gather in a public place is under assault, and our grocery stores are under assault. And the biggest concern that we've got is, if you think about a small town in rural America, the community center is the grocery store, right? People, if you can't get your information on your small computer in your hand, you're going to go where people gather, and they gather in grocery stores. And so for us, it's also making sure that trust doesn't get eroded, that we won't provide them a safe place, no matter whether it's during a crisis or the skies are blue. And so it's what is the role and responsibility of our industry to make sure that we communicate what that looks like.
And Penny, certainly parts of airports aren't the most fun environments right now, and there are other aspects of aviation. So how do you think about sort of the distrust of citizens in your industry, and the frustration that is being manifested, not necessarily on JetBlue or the airlines themselves?
We're never delayed. Yeah. So
I tried.
Yeah, it is such a tough time in the industry right now. I'm an aviator myself and have been with JetBlue, one of the founders, so been with it 23 years, and to see what's happening, it's not because we want to run it like this. Like, this is not the business we want to run. It's just the challenges that we're up against that we have never had to face before, right? So some of it's workforce. You counted on crews to pick up extra hours, and now they don't pick them up anymore because they've learned to do less, more with less. So I think there is a little bit of a reset. Technology definitely takes a place in this, in that customers can help self-accommodate themselves a little bit better. But there's also climate, right? Like the storms that we're facing, or the weather is forecasted for no storms, and now we have a crazy pop-up storm in New York for an hour that just shuts us down because the ramps are closed. So the industry is definitely, it's a growing, we're growing through this. I think we'll become better and stronger, but it is a tough time, and I apologize if we ever canceled your flight or delayed you for several hours, but we will get better.
Thank you. Elena, do you want to apologize on behalf of TSA, or you?
No. No, one thing I wanted to flag is so we were thinking about this going into October for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is why our theme is See Yourself in Cyber, and making sure that the individual understands that you have a responsibility as well. But also to your point, different entities should be delivering messages. Not everybody is going to listen to the government. So as we go into this increased public awareness about cybersecurity, what is the message industry can help to push? What is the message that NGOs can help to push? And what are the ones that government should help push? So this is something that we're going to be working on. It's a top priority for me, kind of closing out this year and going into 2023. But that's why for at least October, it's going to be See Yourself in Cyber.
You got a ready audience. You want to pitch the Cyber Summit, CISA Cyber Summit?
We will, well, one thing for October is we want to get the director, this actually goes to the trust, we want to get the director on the road. We want to get her out of DC and into the communities. So you will definitely see the director out and about a lot more across the country in the communities, participating in events, and then potentially CISA, I don't want to get in front of her, we'll have events as well. But that is just trying to expand and kind of get out of our normal engagements with partners here in the DC area.
I want to save a second for Penny at the end. So Matt, Doug, quick one. What, a year from now, what do you want to be saying on stage that's changed in the last year?
I want to say that we've joined your Slack channel. I want to say that that we have better operational context on the things we touch, that we as an industry have done more. And so I don't want to just stand here and say, give me things. I want to say, I hope that we have done better to facilitate some of those pinch points.
Yeah, I think for me, I want to be able to tell everybody that you can buy toilet paper whenever you need it.
Amen. No flight delays and toilet paper on demand. So that's a goal. Penny.
Yep. So now's the time to raffle our final pair of JetBlue tickets. It is not Spirit, in case you've heard the news, but this is JetBlue. Not yet. So Casey White from Guidehouse, are you here? Is she? Oh, hi, here. Yeah, congratulations.
Thanks to JetBlue for that, and let me just thank the panel. You don't have it. You're good, right? Yeah. Okay. Thanks to JetBlue for that, and thanks to the panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Elena, Matt, Doug, and Penny. Great to be with you.
Hey, thanks a lot for that last panel. Our next and our last panel for this conference is what lessons we've learned from humanitarian efforts confronting today's global challenges. So climate change, a growing food crisis, inflationary pressures caused by conflict, and disasters continue to challenge mechanisms for coordinating internationally. So to take us through this important topic, we've got our friend Jim Thompson, who's the Director for Partnerships and Global Engagement at the National Security Council at the White House. To help us do this, he'll be joined by colleagues from USAID, Team Rubicon, Airbnb.org, and also the MIT Humanitarian Response Lab. So we'll begin right now.
Hi there. It's the last panel. Are you excited? All right. Hi, my name's Jim Thompson. I'm the Director for Partnerships and Global Engagement at the National Security Council at the White House. This is really exciting. I'm thrilled to be back here at the 11th annual conference. I've attended a lot of these over the years. I can't say it was all 11, but it has been quite a number. I always learned a tremendous amount. And one of the things I learned was I am not the smartest person in this room by far. And even as I started to put together questions for this panel, I thought, I probably should ask my panelists what they would want to be asked, because they're going to be smarter about all of this than me. So I asked all of them, I said, why don't you tell me what I should even ask you? So I'm actually going to go ahead and even let them go ahead quickly introduce themselves. Tell me a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from, and then we'll get into some lessons learned about what we've learned over the last year or so as it relates to humanitarian crises that have become both international and domestic at the same time. But let me hear from all of you. Mike, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here. All of you obviously have been in this conference for, I think, a few days, so appreciate your patience. I heard there is not lunch after this, so I'm not holding you to anything. So if anything, just really eager to describe the work that USAID is doing, specifically in managing and responding to the crisis in Ukraine. My name is Mark Simakovsky. I'm a Deputy Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia at USAID. I am responsible for managing and responding to the USAID response to the humanitarian and development and, of course, economic challenge that's wrought by Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. I've actually been on the job for a sum total of 6 months. Arrived coincidentally a month before the invasion. I actually worked Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 at the Pentagon and Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, where I was the Russia director. So have a few lessons learned that I've been able to draw from my experience. But, you know, overall, I think this is an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, a disaster that is sitting in the middle of Europe. USAID has responded, I think, along with the USG in an unprecedented fashion. There obviously is a humanitarian disaster, and so we have been channeling assistance to Ukrainians that have been displaced. 15 million people displaced inside the country, 6 million refugees outside of the country, as well as just incredible mass movements of people in, frankly, an unprecedented fashion in the middle of Europe. We have also marshaled, in a way, resources at the speed of which has never been seen, and surely not since to Europe since the Marshall Plan. The U.S. government has provided $4.5 billion in direct budget support to Ukraine, potentially with another $4 billion coming in a matter of weeks, which my office is working on. The U.S. aid has provided over $1 billion in humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, again, in a fashion and a speed in which that even though the U.S. government was working to prepare for this contingency, we were spending weeks and months, frankly, preparing at the end of last year for this potential and unfortunate eventuality. To still move that level of assistance, I was at a meeting yesterday where we were talking about another tranche of $220 million that was going to be signed to move out the door this week. The numbers are just so impressive, so unfortunately impressive, but also we've gotten to a point where it's just a regular basis of moving tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to assistance to some of our international partners. We also, in my office in the E&E Bureau, has focused on an incredible range of bolstering development assistance. And I want to reinforce that the developmental assistance that we are providing Ukraine is there to help the country integrate. And so there is a humanitarian crisis. We are giving the Ukrainians the tools to win, to defeat Russia and to push back on this aggression. But we also are seeking to help them recover and rebuild the country, not so it's going back to where the Ukraine was before the war, but to ensure and facilitate Ukraine's ability to leapfrog into Europe as an EU candidate member. So in many ways, the assistance and the support that USAID is providing has a dual purpose, which is essentially to help Ukraine and the Ukrainian people meet their own aspirations on integrating with the EU. So we're providing incredible amounts of support on bolstering their education sector, their health sector, helping them with cyber capabilities, helping on democracy and governments, as well as really trying to ensure that the assistance that we're providing isn't going for the wrong places. So building up and their resiliency on anti-corruption as well. And then finally, the for all of you, the private sector plays a huge role in this. Without the private sector and its own support and the bolstering of public and private partnerships, we can't help ensure that Ukraine succeeds. And the private sector, I think in particular, has played a really important role. We have an Assist Ukraine team. One of my colleagues, Avinash, is here, who's been leading our Assist Ukraine team. We were just faced with a deluge of assistance offers very early on in the crisis in February and March, which we had a hard time managing. You know, some was in-kind support, some was how do we get pallets of equipment. So we set up a team in USAID to channel those offers of assistance from the private sector to lean in on the ones that we thought were most effective. But as we move into a stage potentially of recovery and reconstruction, knowing that this conflict still is flaring hot, we have to figure out ways of facilitating and filling gaps of where the USG maybe is not as well positioned, particularly on areas like infrastructure. We've had an incredible donation from a partner for laptops. The school season is coming in Ukraine. The winter is coming in Ukraine, so winterization, getting people back into adequate housing. So again, the challenge will just continue, I think, to overwhelm the resources as we have. So I think we were really looking forward to working with the private sector and the capabilities that private sector has on figuring out how to help Ukraine not only survive but succeed as it moves forward in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I know we're going to have a ton of questions on Ukraine specific, but I'm going to jump quickly to David to talk to us a little bit about his work at Team Rubicon. But really, I want to get into the question of, we've had kind of crisis after crisis this past year, starting with COVID, 2 years ago, then the Afghan resettlement, and then the issues in Ukraine. How has this affected Team Rubicon and sort of what you're doing with the private sector in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I'm David Burke. I'm Team Rubicon's Chief Programs Officer, and Team Rubicon is a veteran-led humanitarian organization that responds to disasters and crises around the world. And the reality of the past 3 years has really changed the trajectory of the organization and needs in our communities, domestically and overseas. So, Mark provided an incredible overview of what's been going on in Ukraine, and Team Rubicon played a role early when the forecast called for a devastating rout of Russian forces across the entire country. Our medical teams were on the ground, but as that forecast faltered and then the Russians, slowed and failed in that initial attempt, our teams quickly transitioned into a training role, trained over 2,000 Ukrainian civilians and medical providers in skills that they needed to support the risks that their communities were facing, different skills than they had used previously or they trained to previously. And then as we look to go back and support Ukraine further, we'll work in two areas that the Ukrainian medical system didn't support before this invasion, and that's portable ultrasound that can greatly increase the effectiveness of battlefield medicine, and whole blood transfusion away from the clinical setting. So it's referred to as blood far forward, which also greatly improves the care on the battlefield. But before any of this happened, our withdrawal as a country from Afghanistan created another crisis, and 70,000 Afghans were trying to get reintegrated into the United States across 11 different military bases. And the overall government infrastructure didn't have a perfect solution for this problem set. And Team Rubicon stepped in and helped manage warehousing and materials and private sector donations valued at around $35 million to just provide basic necessities, conservative clothing, household goods, the things that Afghan families needed as they transitioned off of these military bases and tried to integrate into communities across our country. And these allies supported our efforts in that theater for decades and deserved everything we could provide as a whole community. The private sector stood up. The government worked to find the seams in the authorities to make sure that they could do the best possible. And partners like Airbnb and many, many private sector partners helped make sure those transitions were as smooth as they could be. Team Rubicon's continued in setting up homes, so the last mile of those Afghan families getting to a permanent residence and having a place that is furnished and has basic kitchen necessities so they can continue on this transition. And COVID disrupted the entire country. Every community was equally impacted, but every population was unequally impacted. Different populations across the country, different parts of communities had different levels of resourcing, and Team Rubicon flexed with public and private support to work in 110 different cities across the country to facilitate testing, facilitate vaccination, to the total of about 1.6 million vaccinations across the country that Team Rubicon supported the administration of. And it identified all kinds of different gaps in the system when there's a universal impact. We're very used to the resilience of our country and being able to operate across state lines and move resources from community to community. But when every community is equally impacted, we saw the fractures and the risk of the lack of preparedness or resilience that we have in our systems, because there wasn't the ability to call on our neighbors to help as much as there has been historically in large-scale disasters. So these three different crises have driven a very different perspective of what resilience means domestically and internationally. COVID didn't limit the U.S., and really the inequity of that disease has shown up in the rest of the world in humanitarian indicators decreasing that haven't decreased since World War II, in parts of the world that still don't have sufficient vaccine to vaccinate even their high-risk populations, don't have any treatment options, any of the medical interventions that are possible here. So the COVID pandemic continues to drive an impact on humanitarian need across the entire world, and we're stacked with additional challenges of Afghan resettlement and the Russian invasion in Ukraine.
Thanks, David. And I got to tell you, your work in at least the Afghan resettlement, if nothing else, really brought home the importance of these partnerships and groups working together with Airbnb and other NGOs and the for-profit sector. We had 70,000 people, refugees, show up on our shores in 11 refugee camps spread out across the country. And we didn't have a lot of authorities. It was kind of weird. Normally, we would rely upon FEMA authorities to do what was necessary, but it wasn't a declared emergency, so we couldn't use FEMA's authorities. And we quickly realized it was the end of the fiscal year. There wasn't any money. There obviously wasn't a planned emergency and didn't have those authorities. So suddenly it was like, wow, the Afghans came with very little. And what little they did come with, the luggage that they had, was separated from them at the airports. So they were on base with nothing. And we had to get them clothing, formula, baby bottles, diapers, feminine napkins. And it relied completely upon the private sector and completely upon our friends in the NGO community to help get that and distribute that.
And the 9 chartered resettlement agencies of the country, the other NGOs that do this work year in, year out, didn't have a warning for this. The 70,000 was an increase on their planned resettlement work. So these 9 agencies are entirely overwhelmed, and they responded very, very effectively and nobly, but there was no way to look at your plan for the year and in the last months, with no additional funding, just double your ability, double your capacity, and have it all come at once. So that was an incredible challenge for those organizations, but they've done incredible work.
And it was kind of strange too, because they didn't have the access to the base. And Team Rubicon, having all military veterans, all knew how military bases worked. And they were operating NGO on almost most of the bases that we had. I think the American Red Cross had a couple, but I think you guys ran the lion's share for the bases. So thank you for that work. It was truly a tremendous partnership. And Sadie, I'm going to come to you. I want to hear a little bit about Airbnb, and obviously you guys, such a huge help too with the Afghan resettlement in Ukraine. You come from Airbnb.org, so I'd love to hear a little bit about how Airbnb and Airbnb.org work together. How does that work?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love hearing just the importance of the collaboration. I think it's something that we internally recognize as well. And so Airbnb.org is a separate entity from Airbnb.com. We're uniquely positioned where we are able to tap into the resources, to the funding, to the expertise, to the host community that's on the Airbnb.com platform. But our mission comes straight from our board and our own executives. And so we have one goal, which is essentially to house people who have been displaced, whether by disaster or by forced resettlement, of whether somebody is relocating to another country on their own to seek asylum. And so we are able to offer them free temporary housing that's picked up by our funders and our donors. And so it's really a special place to be because we're able to amplify the impact we have by working with other organizations, whether it's another nonprofit, whether it's a government organization, or whether it's another private sector entity. And so we're always looking for ways to collaborate, and we've learned, particularly with Ukraine and Afghan, the responses, is that the key for us is to figure out what organizations can we align with so that what we can offer can be done in tandem with what they are offering so that it's not disruptive at the time, so it complements that aid, and so that what we're offering is something that's of value both to the organizations so that they can dedicate some time and resources to help us reach the people that are in need. And so we really are in a position where we rely on what we call our allies to help get us that close connection to the people in need, to make that affirmation so we know, are we giving our aid to the people who actually need it, and that we're making a difference and that it's value added for the entire community.
And I'll tell you, it was the strangest offer. It was Airbnb came to us and said, we can offer up housing, thousands, tens of thousands of units of housing. And it was like, normally that would not, I mean, maybe in a FEMA emergency, if there's a hurricane blow through, that is needed. But on a nationwide basis, suddenly to have that offer, that capacity available to us was just huge because that was the one thing that we absolutely needed. Having been down to the base, one of the bases where the Afghans were, we knew we had to get the Afghans off, the Afghan settlers off of these bases. They were in tents that were the size of a football field, one tent, and row after row after row of families sleeping in these tents. And it was like, this was not sustainable, and it's fall. Winter was coming. We knew we had to move quickly. So having Airbnb and the resettlement agencies working together was a true success in a very difficult situation. Sorry. Jared, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about what MIT and your humanitarian lab does. It's kind of fun to have this panel because it's government, NGO, and academia coming together. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you've found in this, and then maybe a little bit about cash versus non-cash, and sort of what you've seen, what works best.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation, for bringing in academic on stage. Our Center for Transportation and Logistics at MIT really focuses on applied research and practical research to drive change and innovation in industry. We have an education program, and I want to tell a little story up front about Ukraine. We have a master's program at MIT in supply chain, as well as partner centers in Spain, Luxembourg, China, Colombia, and Malaysia, and an extensive network. And plus we have some online learners. So there's a lot of people learning about supply chains. During the Ukraine crisis, trying to find a supply chain that can meet needs. We had one alum who's from Ukraine who had connections with a third-party logistics provider who had a warehouse in the U.S., had available contracts. They already had shipping into the country and throughout the country. Another alum had a connection to a health organization that was approved by the Ministry of Health in the Ukraine to be a direct service provider. And so the ability of, we talk about partnerships, the ability of students and networks that they have to connect, supply capability with a direct demand, group that knows the health facilities and has been working with them already. It's not a new thing. To connect supply and demand in real time and help enable that flow is really exciting to see. So the power of students and networks that they have to help facilitate supply chains in crisis. But our lab, at MIT we do research, and we research on supply chains. And yes, we've been doing research on supply chains, even though most people may think that they're going to blame us for the issues of the past few years. But they're complex. They're increasingly complex, and they're especially complex in a crisis. When you lose infrastructure, when there's conflict, and there's a lot of constraints that come into play. And so while I've done work, we just still do work with the private sector during regular times to increase the ability and effectiveness of a supply chain. Our lab focuses on crisis situations, so humanitarian situations. And we've worked globally since our first study was actually the 2003 Indian Ocean tsunami, which was a big sea change in international humanitarian response, and all the way through active work in the U.S. with FEMA and others to help enable the private sector in the U.S. to recover quickly, and what the government can do to support that recovery, that business recovery, which is so essential to meeting people's needs. And it's interesting because we work, internationally with the NGOs and what's called the cluster system, organized by the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And there's been a lot of formalization in the international community about how to engage the private sector. And it started with that tsunami in 2003, when they realized a lot of times they couldn't bring goods in because of all the constraints. The tsunami wiped out so much capacity. But yet there were local providers, local market providers who could adapt and find ways to get food to people and so forth. And they said, well, we could give them cash. They can buy from local markets, which are often, those local markets are a lot more nimble and adaptable. And that proved effective. And then they said, well, how can we learn from this? And a group of organizations, Mercy Corps, Oxfam, Save the Children, Red Cross, got together and created what they called the Cash Assistance Learning Partnership. And it was a partnership created in 2005. They started talking about how can we use cash more effectively going forward. It formalized in 2008 as an organization of a network of organizations. There are some toolkits that came out in 2010 to learn how to better give people cash, because it enables several things. One is it enables them to choose what they need rather than having to guess what they need and send something to them. They get to choose what's most important for their livelihoods and their family. Secondly, it helps that economy that's been devastated recover, because you're feeding and you're stimulating demand, enabling them to get their businesses up and running again and serving those populations. And it's proven effective in many crises, some more than others, in providing cash. But I think there's a lot to learn in this public-private partnership space from this extensive interaction over the years of non-government organizations, nonprofits, learning how to understand how the markets are working, and often in very informal settings, and making sure that they can put cash in effectively. Because if you add cash to a market that doesn't have supply, that you don't know if the supply chains are going to be able to respond, that drives the prices up. And the inflation then makes it such that the other community members aren't able to buy what they would normally buy. So you have to be very careful and delicate with putting cash in the right places where you know that there will be a market to receive it. And I think there's a lot that can be learned in domestic response from what the international community has learned in many responses where they've used cash programming to facilitate the market response and the recovery.
Yeah, you've honed in on one of the questions that I really have is this international versus domestic issues. I feel like this year in particular has been the year where international crises have huge domestic implications. Everything from the Afghans resettling, obviously COVID, with it being a global pandemic and then having a huge impact here in the United States, straight through to Ukraine, where we now have, we've put a number out for 100,000 Ukrainian refugees to come to the United States as well, into our very tenuous refugee systems. Our refugee systems in the United States are managed by several different government agencies, but really rely completely upon the non-governmental organizations to make it work. And they're stressed. So we have yet another international situation that is causing domestic issues. And even the fact of oil prices and inflation, and the fact that it's having sort of what's happening on the international side domestically. So I'm curious, for any of you or all of you, what do you see happening between the international and the national, and sort of how are partnerships able to help us achieve equitable outcomes for the beneficiaries in these types of programs? Are you seeing any change in the way that we've looked at international versus domestic?
I mean, I can start. It gets back to the start of the panel, which is lessons learned and how public-private partnerships can help alleviate humanitarian crises and global challenge. A few lessons learned that we've seen from USAID for Ukraine in particular is one, humanitarian crises don't just happen in areas that are underdeveloped. So you have obviously a war, a raging conventional conflict in the middle of Europe, in the largest country in Europe, from a nuclear armed power. So the impact of that conflict on all Americans, I think, is much more palpable because of the risk of escalation, particularly with the United States choosing to provide the scale of security assistance that is unprecedented to physically provide the Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves. And as a result, the Russian Federation is taking incredible casualties, which is a huge risk of escalation. But as a result of it occurring in a modern country like Ukraine, there are corporations and private sector engagement and people that are operating in Ukraine on a daily basis. So our ability to tap into that, I think, has been very effective for USAID to be able to engage with, and for the private sector to see what it can do inside the country. The other piece I think that has been missing in most international crises around the world for the United States is bipartisan consensus, something that is, I think, a word that doesn't exist very often in Washington. And the scale of the U.S. response was triggered primarily because of an incredible groundswell of bipartisan consensus to support Ukraine, to the tune of hundreds and millions of dollars in assistance, a $40 billion supplemental, again, a number I would have never imagined having dealt with this crisis. So when there is bipartisan consensus, there also is the confidence in the Congress that the American people are going to support an initiative, and private sector and businesses take note of that as well and feel like it's their civic duty as well to engage. The other, I think, is an example of what we're doing now is humanitarian crises in a place, even if it's isolated, will impact everything that you do. So when I go with my 3 kids to the grocery store and buy them a loaf of bread, the price of bread has doubled in some places, and that's because of a global food insecurity, partly triggered by a blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Ukraine, again, has an incredible role to play in exporting grain around the world. So for the last 2 months, my team and I have been developing an approach of, and Administrator Power announced it this month, that will facilitate the utility and the use of $100 million of USAID programs to help Ukraine alleviate its export crisis, which has been driven by the blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Now, there has been a deal agreed to last week. I just got an email that we're hoping potentially one of the ships could move at some point in the next few days. But again, this Russian invasion of Ukraine and this Russian isolation of Ukraine has hampered the ability of the Ukrainians to export. So the U.S. government now is engaged, and the private sector is playing a role. We're meeting on a weekly basis with all the major agricultural companies in the world. We're engaging with our EU counterparts that are seeking to alleviate some of the bottlenecks on Ukraine's land and water routes westward that essentially run independently of the Black Sea ports. Again, very challenging to move centuries of agriculture that has been moving through the Black Sea westward and southward all over the world, to do that overnight to Western land routes. But without the private sector and without the leadership and the assistance that governments can provide, we're not going to be able to alleviate Ukraine's export challenge. And again, I think it's a perfect example of how the public and the private sector can work together to try to not only help Ukraine, but help those that are suffering as a result of food insecurity around the world. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask if you guys want to quickly respond, that'd be great, but I really would love to get into sort of what the private sector is doing in Ukraine now. But
yeah, I'm happy to jump in and tag on to that. So one of the things we do is that you heard me mention that we are able to tap into the expertise of our Airbnb.com team. And so we have policy folks that work, we're a global enterprise, and we have policy folks that are positioned across the globe. And so when we're thinking about the difference between domestically or responding in a global setting or internationally, we rely on them to tell us, to navigate how these different countries and their regulations and their policies work, what kind of aid is going to be available to people who are displaced, what is the time frame that we can fit in where our temporary stays are beneficial to people who are displaced, what do we have to be mindful of, what is our host community, how are they going to be impacted? What are the short-term rental regulations? And so they, in turn, have their own relationships with governments in these international locations. They have relationships with other nonprofits, with universities, with other private sector entities. And so we rely on them to give us that feedback so that when we're thinking about how we're going to position ourselves operationally, we're doing so in a way that makes sense for each of these countries. And I think for us, that's what allowed us to essentially think about what do the folks who are fleeing need and how can we position them so that they have the agency to say where they want to go. And so we don't focus on where we think they want to go. We focus on if we see that they're going to these locations and this is how we need to operate in Italy, this is how we have to operate in Poland, this is how we have to operate in Germany. We make sure that we rely on that expertise so that we're setting it up so we can offer our aid consistent with those other regulations and support the pathway for them to get the aid that exists in those other locations.
That's great. Anything on, I'm curious because you're from Airbnb and Ukraine is not a developing country by any stretch of the imagination. Their use of technology is on par with the rest of Europe. I'm wondering, have we seen technology play a role in that and in enabling them to go where they want to go?
Yeah, it's always a concern, right? We're a tech company. We rely on a tech platform. We need access to things like the internet, to smartphones, to laptops. And so part of that is thinking about, are the people tech savvy that we're going to be supporting? And when we're thinking about our diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities, we want to engage with organizations who are working with people or positioned to provide that one-to-one support. So a lot of times, we can certainly engage with organizations who are churning out, they have a really highly organized system and are helping thousands of people. We can work with them. We can also work with people who are set up to actually spend one-to-one time on smaller populations. And so we're flexible enough that we can offer that support and leverage those relationships with those other organizations. All of our aid goes straight to the person. We rely on our partners to help us get it to them. Sometimes it looks like just getting an email. Sometimes it looks like, hey, let me help you set up this account. This is how you upload your ID or things like that. And so that's why they're so important to us. We're a small team, but what we can do, the impact when we part with other organizations is expounded enormously.
Jared, are you seeing a real difference in this situation versus others?
It's different in many ways. There's a lot of the international actors are used to working with governments that may not have the same capabilities as the Ukrainian government. Mm-hmm. So the Ukrainian government can play a little bit different role than in a lot of other responses that we've seen. But I kind of want to come back to the question about the international and domestic, because like Mark was just mentioning that we're having to think about a land route for moving grain. Like that's a big shift in planning. But big shifts in planning would be needed in the U.S. for a domestic disaster. In fact, we've been doing work with FEMA. We did work with FEMA around the exercise this year around Cascadia earthquake. You're going to lose the seaports. You're going to have a massive land route to bring food and supplies into the Seattle area. And it was highlighted before the importance of planning together with the private sector. That planning together about what would you do if you have to do something you haven't ever thought of before. And a lot of companies may not have thought of this either. So I think a little bit of that preparedness work ahead of time, learning from what the experiences we have internationally to think about scenarios where we might need to be thinking more directly about engaging the private sector in that planning and in that contingency work. The other thing I'd mention is a lot of discussion about small businesses. And internationally, and I'm guessing in the Ukraine as well, a lot of the cash aid is going to be supported by small businesses. It's hard to understand fully how they work, but work ahead. And you mentioned before, Mark, about the link between economic development and a crisis response. A lot of work we do in the U.S. around economic development can be leveraged by understanding how businesses work in order to see how they can be a unique role in supporting communities, which a lot of times in the small businesses serve the the more vulnerable communities. So there's a lot of parallels there too, internationally, domestically, about how we can work in lower scale, more fragmented private sector settings to better serve the most vulnerable people.
David, I want to come back to you on this question because I mean this really gets to the heart of resilience. And you know, if we establish like a new baseline for resilience, and what do partnerships have play in that role?
And yeah, it's a great kind of segue from Jared's comments around Cascadia and what are we really planning for? How do we define a baseline that we can be resilient to? If you look at the happenings of the last 3 years. The last 3 years have reset everyone's expectation of what we need to be prepared to endure and how we can show resilience through it. I think the connection from the grain trying to get out of Ukraine to grain prices in Africa, where many cash programming pilots are still ongoing. There's minimum basic income, universal basic income pilots all over the African continent in different locations, and now the grain prices are skyrocketing because it's not available from Ukraine, and it's going to corrupt the research there and how effective cash can be. And so this new baseline that we have to think about operating in, a persistent potential war on the European continent, is a different planning factor. And if we're, as the opening panel said, always planning for the last disaster, we're never going to make progress towards the new state that we're living in. And one more interesting point on cash that I think is really important that Jared didn't extend all the way into was this idea that you can leverage the local markets as effectively as possible. That also opens up the infrastructure for things that local markets can't provide. So then our private sector partners can move goods that are truly needed and truly valuable for those crises, and the infrastructure is not so clogged that you can't move anything. When in 2010, Team Rubicon's founding response, there were winter coats showing up in Haiti. It's not a very useful item. So if cash can do as much of the lifting as possible, then the infrastructure remains open to support the more accurate needs that come out of those initial assessments.
And I'd like to highlight too, in the U.S., we have a lot of the challenges internationally with cash is how to ensure the security of the transfer of the cash, the identity of the people, the data, there's a lot of issues in getting cash to people, and there's a lot of good work on that. In the U.S., we've done a lot of that work with SNAP. We can turn on emergency SNAP. And so the ability to use SNAP more effectively and understand how that's being used by the local markets and so forth, I think there's a lot of potential to learn from when we've been able to activate cash to support the vulnerable in emergencies in the U.S.
We only have a couple minutes left here on the panel, but I really wanted to come to one last thing on Ukraine, which is what more can we do? What more can the private sector do in Ukraine specifically? I think, Mark, I don't know where you're sitting, maybe back there, but I keep track. There you are. We do at the White House watch your tracker on Ukraine. I do report the numbers up to the suite on how much the private sector has donated to different disasters, and over $1 billion now of private sector donations have gone to Ukraine, in and around Ukraine, for humanitarian assistance. There will be a rebuilding phase, at some point, hopefully soon. And I'm curious what our panel thinks about what more can we do in Ukraine? What more can the private sector do in Ukraine?
I'll start knowing maybe we'll save a minute for everyone on this. So one, unfortunately, the needs are unlimited in Ukraine, and I'm seeing the kinds of assistance that none of us would have imagined. And most importantly, I think we have to be responsive to Ukrainian needs and what Ukrainians are requesting. There was a Lugano conference a few weeks ago around July 4th that our assistant administrator participated in, where the Ukrainians have rolled out their initial plans for recovery and reconstruction. And those are broken out into a whole range of sub areas, geographic areas. But I think clearly being responsive to Ukrainian needs in terms of education, one. I think that there are limits in terms of what the USAID has been able to provide in terms of resources for helping Ukrainian kids get back to school. So laptops, materials, remote learning, infrastructure, again, in-kind contributions in cash to organizations that are facilitating education is one. I think, winterization in terms of where things are going with the Ukrainian population being vulnerable and without shelter. Another, I think, is healthcare. Clearly, is a huge need. Something that Team Rubicon has been doing in terms of supporting the medical system. And I also think that there is a whole range of assistance to provide to build resiliency in communities, particularly communities that have been uprooted. Obviously, infrastructure is another area of being able to, again, provide the Ukrainian government the kind of assistance and technical support to physically rebuild the hard infrastructure. I think the U.S. government has had mixed success in the past on supporting infrastructure, and it's something that we don't have the resources yet to commit to. But most importantly, I think, again, engaging with the public sector, with the U.S. government on areas where the private sector can provide assistance. And because of our implementing partners and our experience on the ground and our connections that we have at USAID with the Ukrainians, we can put people in touch to get resources to the best use very quickly.
That's great. Other thoughts quickly?
I'll jump in quickly. The one universal truth, domestic and international, is disasters and crises start and end locally. Local populations are impacted first, and they're impacted for the longest, and they have the longest route to recovery. So, to jump on Mark's point, trust the Ukrainian government, trust the Ukrainian organizations that know what the needs are, and identify a trusted partner to work implementation with, or provide unrestricted funding to give flexibility. If we've seen anything in this crisis, it's been constant change. Every forecast, every estimate from every government that's been functioning with the Ukrainian government has been less than perfectly accurate. So if funding is overly restricted, the organizations you're trying to support don't have the opportunity to flex to a changing environment. And I think we'll continue to see a changing environment in Ukraine.
Yeah, I love the unrestricted funding. That's really important. The other thing is to be really clear about what you can offer. So know what it is, whatever your organization's superpower or the resource that you have or can tap into, and be able to offer that clearly and let people know how they can get to it. This is what I can give you. This is what we've got to offer. This is how you get it.
I guess I'd say I think a lot of times companies may not see a role in the reconstruction or restoration and recovery in a foreign country, especially if they don't have a strong presence themselves. But the capabilities of the Ukrainian government and the needs that people have understood may provide an opportunity to learn differently on how they can be more engaged internationally and work with governments to better restore capabilities that are improved versus what they were before.
Well, Mark, David, Sadie, and Jared, thank you very much for participating in this conversation. Truly interesting, really well laid out for us. I think it was great to get the questions from you as opposed to make them up myself. I'd like to thank Rob Glenn and the U.S. Chamber and Mark DeCourcy for having us here today, and a big round of thanks to our panelists for engaging in this conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for the insights there from the international standpoint. So this is it. I'm really happy everyone decided to stay. I just also want to say thanks again to our partners at DHS, FEMA, CISA, the SBA, NOAA, and NORAD, and U.S. Northcom on the federal support, then also our SHAPE leaders, Abbott, Amazon, Supply Chain, AmerisourceBergen, BD, the Coca-Cola Company, FedEx, Guidehouse, Leidos, the Medtronic Foundation, Procter & Gamble, Shell, and the UPS Foundation. So it really does require all of those entities, but all of you as well, and the organizations that you're part of. This conference is really not the only thing that we do. Certainly, it's one of the most visible things that we do year-round, and so we're glad that you could do so in person. It's always nice to get that networking opportunity, and I think I might have another one really briefly. So we know the world is a dynamic place, right? You've heard that time and again, whether it's increasing climate change, the adaptation we need to make from an infrastructure standpoint, the cost of disasters, the investment that we can make potentially in mitigation. We heard about that this morning. We heard from Ken Graham and some doom and gloom scenarios yesterday from a climate standpoint. We also heard from the Secretary this morning some of the additional threats and risks and hazards that our communities face here, but also abroad. You will get a opportunity here. The Kentucky flooding is something that I've been tracking this morning, and it's if you're interested or you're considering sharing information about the situation in Kentucky flooding, you could just meet over at this front table. So many of us are probably doing the same thing. So if that's an opportunity for us to maybe do some good immediately as an action item at the conclusion of this conference, we certainly want to offer that up. One other thing is that you will get a survey at the probably sometime this afternoon. Please take the time. Feedback is a gift. You want to see less of Rob Glenn? Great. That's awesome. And we can bring up other people that can also, facilitate the dialogue. But certainly we tried hard to get the right kind of content and the time allotted, and also reflecting that, like many of you, we're trying to navigate these waters of in-person, not in-person, hybrid. So any kind of feedback would be helpful. Also, one thing, just mark your calendars for next year, July 2023, the last week. Don't know the date yet, but that's when we're going to do the next conference. It'll be here in Washington, D.C., and certainly look forward to having you and so many others like you in this room. And with that, thanks for a great conference. Really appreciate it. And be safe, be kind, and do some good. Thank you.